Well, the role of a moderator is that of a provoker. Let me start from you. I'm not here to defend communism or any other wing, but wealth is for sure a value, but other values exist. If we concentrate our analysis on wealth, I agree. But yes, the welfare system has never been created by a private person, but over centuries I've seen states, dominant states, try through taxation, albeit too high, I agree, to acquire resources and reallocate resources to have a social benefit and a good whole of the country first. You mentioned the French Revolution as a major divide, but it stems from the need of the middle class bourgeoisie to become a state. And it blew up because of a non-sustainable inequality, social inequality. So states, I would be more cautious. If we speak of state as a limitation of wealth, okay, but if we believe that this is the only task and role of the state, no. The state has also other roles, or would we want to go back to when public hospitals didn't exist? And do we want to deny that welfare system has produced an improvement in the level of education, demonstrable by any kind of statistics, better human conditions? Would we want to go back to the times of Verga? I'd like to understand this. I mean, wealth is okay, important, but it's important how to use it. I don't accept seeing that in 1974 the relationship between the first 100 American corporates, top managers, and their employees was 1 to 74. In 07 is 1 to 200 something. There's something wrong that I don't understand with this. Valletta, was making 40 times less than Marchionne, and this is really not acceptable to me. If we want to say that a manager should get 1,000, 2,000 more than somebody else, let's then ask ourselves why. In that kind of United States or Europe with Ford, Fiat, if in that period of time managers were all stupid, or there was perhaps a different sense of what the role of private institutions was. The state, is this the only institution to create wealth, or does it have any other roles to play? The second aspect, the second question I have for you is what has happened? You may say it's the fault of the states must be blamed, but the reaction of the public opinion is well defined. If you are really in a financial crisis that you don't understand, but you understood that somebody took a benefit out of this and that the situation is risky, do we want to also give to the state the fault, the mistake of securitization and all the problems that came after this? The public reaction is that of saying, well, okay, we will no longer allow you to use the toy anymore. But this is typical, finance and financial community have been blamed for having creating problems. But now what they say is that the damage you have caused is not necessarily only economic, but also civil. So obviously you cannot go on this way. Third, how would you justify the series of nationalization that took place in 50 years? When Mussolini created IRI, he saved capitalism from a big hole it had been launched into. When in the 60s, Enel was set up and created. Simply read what the situation was like at the time of the various Italian companies to understand that some were doing well, but others were doing less well. So my question to you is, are we not risking with your analysis to move from one pendulum to the other, saying that the state is always to be blamed and is doing things really always bad? it would seem to me that, we should find something that does not take us to the extreme. You mentioned the telephone companies. Stet of Pascal and Gambarale was working much better than what happened with Agnelli, Tronchetti, and what we see now. So I'd like to understand here whether you would say something for the state function.
I was referring to the fact that they also invented the theory of natural monopolies to justify the presence of the state in various sectors. And this was a more general, let's say, topic. Well, that the state creates a social cohesion and things like this would be very debatable, questionable. Certainly a great Swedish social democrat, after his strife in favor of a more redistributive theory, recognized in the Social Democratic Party and said, I fought with the means of the state, but I have to acknowledge that for poor people, it's better to have 1 year of growth of wealth in the market compared to any state intervention. And this was a social democrat saying this. Now, the distinction that you are referring to obviously stems from the work of John Stuart Mill that had a negative effect, negative and widespread effect in particular, through his distinction, which is the one between laws regulating creation of wealth and production of wealth, and the laws which instead regulate the circulation of wealth. John Stuart Mill says that once wealth is created, politicians may decide and do everything they want. My friend Steve and myself, we both belong to the more Austrian school of the economy that has always demonstrated very clearly that that wealth is already created appropriate, otherwise it's not created altogether. So the so-called redistribution function is nothing more than the destruction function of wealth, and it fuels phenomena of parasitism, which then obviously have a negative impact, and this has been true for the south of Italy in particular. So the redistribution in particular has never led anywhere through, none of the problems has ever been saved through the welfare state. The black community in the US that has been subject to a strong attack from this point of view has a standard of living which are lower compared to other minorities compared to the way they were in 1960, after 5 years of savage redistribution, after having obviously been the customers of the Democratic Party, as we've seen. They have a standard of living which is certainly superior to that of Sweden, because obviously America is much richer, but it's much, much lower of what it was in 1960 for the black community, when in Mississippi they couldn't even drink at the same fountain with white people. So I don't want to raise a polemic here. I don't want to. Oh, no, why not? I like being polemic. I don't know why I say that I don't want to be polemic. I like it. It's the salt of life. But if you find only one example in which the welfare state has helped Calabrese or the American black population, Calabria in the south of Italy receives from the state as much as no other individual community receives in the States. So if then you are obsessed with redistribution, just to finish this, Gianni Rivera was one of the best players in the 60s. He got 12 times what the head accountant of a company got as a salary. Ibrahimovic, I think 500, 1,000 times that of a head accountant. Things have changed. It depends on how much wealth is generated. The problem is that if everything occurs within a distribution that's been decided by the market, and here we have the example of Stuart Chamberlain within the distribution of the quarter of the cent for him, and then the wealth change. If it's the result of voluntary transactions, I see nothing bad in this. But you always talk about welfare. I think that, for instance, the free school, mandatory school, is not welfare, it's civilization. Just as we know that 70% of our deficit belongs to the health sector, and this is wrong. The US health system doesn't seem to be the correct one to me. So from this point of view, is that too welfare? Should we go back to the old situations where the state had a minor role, but should we go back to the Verga period, or should we instead acknowledge that well beyond welfare, the state also needs resources? Because obviously a policeman costs, a fireman costs, a teacher costs, or should we take away all sorts of... sorry, okay. I'd like Steve to answer, possibly.
Well, a couple of things. First, I think it's true wealth isn't the only value or the only thing that we might care about. But whatever we think the state should or should not do, it needs wealth to do that. It can't create that wealth itself. So so putting wealth as a primary consideration is going to be important. And I think that goes to the John Stuart Mill point, which is how you choose to distribute wealth is going to affect how much wealth gets produced. And when you engage in significant redistribution, you're going to undermine how much wealth gets produced in the first place. And eventually the parasite is going to eat the host. And you can't keep going. And I think to some degree that's what we're seeing happen right now. One other small point I would want to make here. I think people often talk about the idea of the state as an agent of social cohesion or something like that. I think that's actually backwards. I think the real agent of social cohesion is trade and exchange. When we engage in trade with people, that's where we create social relationships. And there's several sort of aphorisms here, but there's the one credited to the French economist Bastiat that where goods cross borders, armies won't. Okay, it's not Bastiat, yeah, but the idea is correct. I think there's Hayek talks about the Greek word that meant was the root of the Greek word that meant to exchange. How the same word was used to mean to admit into the community and to change from an enemy into a friend. And so I think there's something about exchange. And the last is I think it's Voltaire who said one of the great things about the marketplace in Amsterdam is that the Jew and the Christian and the Mohammedan could all be there together exchanging regardless of their own particular belief systems, right? So one of the things we see happen in markets is that people really only care what the color of your money is, not so much what, say, the color of your skin or anything else. So what markets do and what trade does is make us interdependent on each other. We are much less likely. I have no desire whatsoever to set off a bomb in my local supermarket, right? Because if they do, I have a big problem. I'm not getting much food because I don't grow it myself. Okay, so I think that trade and exchange are really important parts of how we get social cohesion. Conversely, what politics does, as Marco suggested, and by the way, it's great to have. Usually, I'm the Marco in the room. Not today. So I get to be in the middle, right? So I'm okay. Yeah, you've got my right wing covered here.
Right on your right.
Yeah. So the last point, I think what happens when the state grows bigger and we see more state intervention, state solutions are inevitably one size fits all. There's winners and there's losers. And so what happens is people fight over the spoils. So you bring up public education and then the debate becomes, well, what should we teach? And these become these vicious debates in the United States in particular about what the curriculum should look like and all these sorts of things. And there can only be one solution. It's a one size fits all. In the marketplace, I like purple or lavender today, right? Not everyone has to like the things I like. We don't vote on what ties to wear or what clothing to wear, what magazines to read or what websites to go to. We all have our own ways of solving those problems ourselves. And so what politics tends to do, whatever, again, we think the scope for the state is, we have to recognize that politics actually, I think, fragments societies and breaks down cohesion by turning us against each other because only one of us or one group of us can win.
Allora, vorrei passare adesso a Verzelli e poi lasciare la parola al pubblico. Il resto della mia idea chiaramente che
I still believe, though, that we have an excess of state and taxation, maybe an excess of taxation more than an excess of state. But I still believe that there's nothing savage in liberalism. I've never seen a savage liberalism, to be honest, but history should be seen through different lenses and not only through the accumulation of wealth. And the political class should also think about social cohesion. If you talk about the health system and mandatory education in the US, I think they're the worst models existing worldwide. So I disagree with you. Unfortunately, I have been in a hospital in the US, and I'm the son of a doctor here in Italy, and there's no comparison, let's say, between the two systems. Now, if you talk about the south of Italy, Calabria, well, it's just too easy. I'm talking maybe about the whole of Italy, the average of Italy. Well, there's excellent health also in Italy. Excuse me, yes. Well, go into Switzerland if you want. I can assure that the health system is very good, but I'm not here to defend Italian physicians. And there's an excellent health system in this country too. This is what I think. I mean, go and see what the results are for the Italian wards, what Italian doctors do when they go abroad, how Italian patients are treated. Then if we want to hold a conference in this, I'm here for this. But I mean, I'm also a good friend of Oscar Giannino here. But I think just as I can't stand people who say that the state is all good and that it's all necessary, to hear that all that which the state does is just a theft, is just stealing away from the private, really leaves me a bit baffled, to be honest. I mean, there are two extremes I disagree with on both sides. So, but there is a point which is more political, maybe, that you see as bankers in this moment, well beyond what Professor Bassani is saying. In this moment, I think that public opinion puts the blame on you. Obviously, we know what Bush has done, what Clinton has done, and a lot of people think that the evil hides itself in two categories: the politician and the banker. If we carry out a poll, we would find this to a large extent to be true. And you have a reputational problem at this point, because on one hand you have to, you receive all of the criticisms even when you're not to be blamed, and on the other hand, you are subject to a political class that's there looking for a possible scapegoat. So according to you, what would be the best solution to get out of this? Should we get to an agreement between the two powers and get to a solution in which we reform some laws, you create some constraints, because even inside you, obviously, the reforms are necessary, or should we go back to the initial levels, because there have been some rotten elements, but in reality what's happened is that certain means have been ill used. And I'm thinking here about derivatives and paper on paper of this year. Well, obviously, the solution that everybody has to go back and do what he's good at doing. I have found myself in a situation in which, in one evening, in a debate with politicians, not knowing how to get out of the mire, they started saying, "Are you bankers?" So obviously we need to think about this. As Professor was saying before, obviously there is a social discrepancy. There's a big gap between banker and banker as well. So maybe we should deny these similarities, because they're not always right. The American bankers receiving a certain type of bonus are a lot. They are managers. The Italian bankers instead, which end up with a great, which end up on the papers, they get very good liquidations. They get severance pays, and they are obviously they're not far from the multiples that they were referring to. The difference between what Rivera was making, the football player, and what another was making. So. And then, obviously, sometimes in the papers, we read these stories and we say, but how is it possible for this person to have all of this money in such a short period of time if they all start off from the same base?
So, I'd like to say and clarify this a little bit. I think that, this is a very heterogeneous problem. You have to be frank. I mean, the problems which belong to the system are in most cases coming from an excess of Italian political presence into the financial system. Now, this is a history. When we see that there are certain institutions and bankers that have been appointed for certain roles. Why? Simply because they were supporting a certain political party? Well, this is our problem, a very peculiar one. When we discover that certain judges or magistrates are very critical vis-a-vis bankers, and you understand that sometimes they don't even have a clue of what lending is about in this country. When politicians say today, we will take measures because banks must lend, but what money and to whom? When the banking industry and system is blocked and stuck because it has been overlending for bad or good reasons, following political pressure in certain cases. So right now, even if the project is good, they don't have enough money to increase the exposure of their bank. Let me give you an example. For instance, in the real estate industry, for instance, where the non-performing loans are too much, really huge. Why? Because in the past, probably some bankers, and so this is not because they don't want to really excuse people who were not really to be blamed. But, some people really made loans to few people who enjoyed a certain political support. When I say pressure and political support, I don't want to always make you believe that there were benefits or returns. More basic politicians that really were very much focused on the territory, on development, because these things could be solved. So pressures on a certain system, banking system, were obviously evident. Now, with this, I am not here to defend a certain category 360 degrees, because in Italy we have a different problem in terms of controls, a problem of governance. They do not work, but they don't work, what I mean, is not on big issues. We think about derivatives. No. In very tiny little things, they don't work. We discover that, an old lady dying is paying 120 euros in the A bank, but in the other bank, she would only pay for a stamp, for instance, and nothing. I mean, these are daily problems and problems that are less present to many top managers that may not necessarily be politicized, much more than the problem of daily issues. If the structured product is being sold with 5 world indices to somebody who is 78, this is a problem. But these are the things, however, that should make us believe on what doesn't work in the banking industry. The bank, for instance, that sells a product at a higher price should shut down and close. And unfortunately, we know that things are much riskier than it would seem. The old lady that goes to a certain bank and then to another bank with different conditions. Somebody should regulate the authority. We have too many such people. We would need a government that really governs, not so many governments, governing a little bit here and there. Well, in Italy, at least a government that would govern, at least, for the first time. Otherwise, these reforms will never take place. And reforms, let me go back to saying this, not to save a category that has lights and shades. Where do they come from? What is the country where for decades they have not been doing anything in the banking industry, legal system and laws? It's Italy. Well, on this, I agree with Professor Bassani. What was an excess of state presence will increase, because with the public opinion like the one we are seeing these days, it's going to be very easy to have a political structure or party saying, have you seen? This is exactly, the consequence of a wild policy. Come to me and I will guarantee the banks react and act correctly, that managers have a certain wage cap on them, and we'll go back. I think this is dangerous, though. at a time the government is the largest shareholder of any individual, of any bank, of any private retail capital, saying that the government has a role. Well, we'll say that, if we ever say that, when the right role will come, 6-7%. Judges, magistrates, and policemen, law and order people. Questions from the floor, maybe if we have a microphone, that would help for the translation. Otherwise, we won't be able to hear.
Talk about bankers. We get focused on groups of people and not the actions people undertake, right? Bankers, I'm willing to blame bankers for the crisis in the following sense. Many bankers asked for the very kinds of regulation and cozied up to governments in ways that caused these problems in the first place. And we should blame bankers for that if we think that's the source of the problem. So it's not about whether or not we blame bankers or not bankers. We got to ask the question, what did they do? And the causes of where we are today, I think, are so complicated. We have to try to untangle some of those issues. And the danger of blaming bankers, even if they deserve some of the blame, but sort of the blanket blaming of bankers, is that in fact bankers and financial people do create wealth. They do create value. They do have this incredibly important role to play. And if we turn them into the scapegoats and the bad guys, we might get rid of the problems they contributed to, but we might throw the baby out with the bathwater also, right? I think it's really important to remember what I like to call Horowitz's first law of political economy, which is nobody hates capitalism more than the capitalists. Okay, and sometimes it's the very bankers and the very people who we think of as the supposed creators of wealth, who are the ones going to government and asking for the kinds of favors and protections and so on that end up undermining growth for all of us and redistribute towards them. So we have to I think even people like Marco and myself, who are very sympathetic to a large scope for the market and a limited scope for government, have to recognize that private sector actors are sometimes the bad guys when they're the ones going in asking for policies that are destructive of wealth.
Well, but it's a lot easier to go and get taxpayers' money because it's right there, but consumer preferences are much more difficult.
Ed è un rischio che obiettivamente noi vediamo tutti.
Yes, it's a risk that we see every day, which in this moment, as I was saying, the urge is to say enough. Let's take away all type of management, all type of control to those who have led us into this. Yes, but public opinion counts zero. Let's not tell us the story. It counts very little. Well, here the discussion is on another front, but you're very close to Pareto, Professor, as in terms of your ideas. We're very close. But when we go to the elections and you see the five-star movement rising, and I mean, when I see certain proposals, I'm horrified, even from the point of view, from an accountant point of view, where do we find the money? But then I see that this movement gets a 25%, that it's self-disintegrating itself. This is another matter. So what was the program of the five-star movement? Yeah, this is what worries me. This is what scares me. The important thing is that it goes against the system. So, I mean, this is what scares me. So it's a 25% in favor of the minimum salary. That's really understood how much this costs us. But it could have been a rational action. But instead, it's dictated by, very often, ignorance and a lack of knowledge of the true problems. Mr. Verzelli, you were talking about the authority before and the need to have an authority. Italy is full of authority agents, let's say. But who looks after, who monitors the authority? What you were saying on public health, I belong to the sector. I am a physician in reality, even though I now work as a researcher. And I can tell you from my experience that the Italian health sector is, it's not bad, but it's been the theatre of political manipulations that have transformed a professional promotion in really a gym of political allegiance, and this has gone against all of the meritocracy elements. If a part of public health works, I think we owe it to physicians, to doctors themselves, that often do not occupy the top positions. But I'd like to to go back to what Marco was saying before. Why isn't it possible to think that a state could become smaller, could fragment itself to get closer to the people who govern our country, so that it will be the individual communities to decide what share of detaxation or of welfare they want to have. If they have too much welfare, they go towards bankruptcy. If they've got too few of it, they might march towards the fiscal haven of the super rich people that a lot of people are leaving, are abandoning. Couldn't there be a more decentralized system, a polycentric system in which, as Marco Bassani would say, we could get to a consensual share of Keynesian policy? I mean, the question is for whom? Well, I'd simply like to say that I admit Keynesian acts amongst willing adults. Obviously, if they are adults, if they agree to this, if they don't attack the wealth of other peoples. Now, the serious problem of all of these policies is that they're not really voluntary. I mean, the politicians can imagine a social question. They create it fictitiously. They are voted, and basically, be it politicians or technicians, they increase taxation. I mean, what is there of revolutionary in increasing taxation? I can't really understand this, but what's happened from the 80s onwards has been an amazing increase in taxation. When we reached 100% of deficit, it was at 24-25% in the first years of the 80s, because Craxi, the governor of the time, realized that a taxation of 70% would have caused a revolt. And so for many years, public expenditure was financed with 8-10% or even more. And we had Maurizio Sacconi in 1987. He was the rapporteur of the financial document. So there really is a long history. And Mr. Tremonti was there to say everything was perfect. So there's a long history that connects the history of our country from a taxation of 100% of GDP. And Italy will have to tackle these problems. And it will have to be the first one to do so, because it's the first one who got to 100% of the GDP of public debt. And so it finds itself really taken aback, because now it's, the currency is not printed by Italy, but it's printed by a cartel of country that Italy is a part of. And I'm very pleased to hear this, because finally the politicians are there. Now, the idea of a state that reduces itself to political acts which are closer to the true center, to the true voters. What do you think, Mr. Horowitz?
The kinds of things Marco's talking about would be progress, right? That we want, and I want to emphasize one of the things he talked about in his presentation, which is this idea of the right of exit, right? The idea that certainly his, the history that he told, I think, is right. That we saw the ability of people to leave situations, small kingdoms where taxation was oppressive, and find places where it was more congenial. We actually see this happening in the United States among states, right? It doesn't happen quite as powerfully, but states who want to attract business can do so in a whole variety of ways. But it also has the advantage of again bringing you can never get governments to be, I think, truly voluntary in a meaningful sense. But you can approach that ideal by decentralizing in the ways that Marco's talking about. Because what you're doing is you're giving people that right of movement and that flexibility to get out if they're not happy with how their particular government is operating. And I think that's the real cost of large empires, of large transnational or in the old sense of nation, but large continental type governments, is that you lose that option of getting out if you don't like the policies. It's harder anyway.
Allora, adesso altre domande, una risposta.
Now, as far as health and as far as waste is concerned, I have an answer for you. We talk about the waste of public administration constantly. This doesn't mean that because politicians have abused of this, destroying resources very often, this doesn't mean throwing away, as Horowitz was saying, the baby with the water, because one can also, it should be possible also to attack politicians and for what they're doing, obviously, which is an offence. Well, nobody has managed to sue politicians for what they had done, obviously. So, yes, it's very difficult from a legal standpoint, I know, because the absence of merit is not a crime considered in our criminal code.
Problem, though, when politicians make mistakes, they don't get the signals and they don't have the incentives to correct them. And so the problem of the political mistakes is not just, that's not, we say in the United States, that's not a bug, that's a feature, right? It's not the accident. That's endemic, structural in the system. And so I think we have to think really carefully about how is it that politicians ever learn when they've made mistakes, and what incentive do they have to correct them?
Questo è sicuramente un punto. Prego. Le elezioni.
Yes, this is the point. Elections should be the moment, please. I'll be very quick. I was just saying the opposite. I said each people should do its role, for instance, but, they should work better, less authority. The Monti government has been increasing the number of these people and authority also. So I think that, the cost should be reduced, not simply the waste, but the structure of an excessive cost to the state. Why should Italian banks have so many people? Why do they have so many people? BNP Paribas, 20 years ago, they were moving towards the IT platforms, but Italian banks were, waging wars to who would buy more branches or agencies. Now they are closing down. So I feel much more, liberal and free to reason in this way, so closer to the eminent guests. But banks now have to spend a lot of money to fire too many people. Why 3.5 public employees or officials? Not that they must, wind up starving, but why can't we think of adopting on them similar mechanisms and to bring their number down gradually? Unless politics performs its duty, you cannot, believe that banks or other structures may perform their sacrifices or do that where he who should stand as an example is not acting in this way. So less authority, this is what I mean. If we look at the idea of authorities and structures in the past few years, the cake was becoming smaller and smaller, but all these structures, by contrast, were proliferating, mushrooming. Why? Because they were public. Now on this idea of ineffective authorities, we have to be careful. We are seeing that authorities themselves then are subject to cross events by shareholders. They receive pressure. So rather than being authority, they all are political authorities. They intervene and step in with a political not referee kind of role. They support, like a fan, certain positions, and they have a more distorted position with the spending review. We are blocking the turnover in very delicate and challenging sectors where more people would be needed, and we don't fire other people in other sectors where they should be fired, with so many superfluous officials around. So this is even worse than not being able to fire or to send back home. The effect is a distortion, a negative distortion. Please. Let me tell you before that I quite agree with the liberal ideas that have been expressed. But if we look at such a country like China, we see that China has been adopting extremely liberal policies. And in the past 30, 40 years, China has been making giant strides. What have they done? They have been liberalizing their means of production as good communists. They are still communists, but they have leveraged the capitalist structure to make money, to cash in. And, I think that we should think about this. I agree with you. We should have less government. The more the state is decentralized, and the better things can be harmonized. But equally true is that for certain great projects or ambitious things, it takes a central authority that has the means of production, the necessary capital that can only be owned by a government and nobody else. Having said this, however, my question to you, Mr. Horvitz, especially, is about the it's a monetary policy issue. In the United States, since the latest quarter of the Bush administration, the United States has been printing 600, 700 billion of dollars every quarter. And with Obama, the process has been stepping up. So the United States has been printing money as if nothing existed. China continues to print money. We don't know how much, but probably the same amount as in the United States, because they continue to buy their bonds, and probably even more than that. Now, here in Europe, because of Teutonic, as they say, German-like kind of winds, or because of the ECB, Europe is not printing money, very little so. My question to Horvitz and to Verzelli is, would Europe do much better to print money, as somebody like Silvio said, or wouldn't it? Would it be good for Europe or not? So, a question on quantitative easing in Europe also, please.
Okay, velocemente.
A couple of words. I'd like to know more about the concept of economic equality vis-à-vis future generation. We have seen the debt, which was 2,000 billion worth of euro in 2012. Well, I wish it were like this, but if you have been paying all your life and then you retire, you have a credit until, obviously, you live, and somebody has a debt vis-à-vis you. The discounted value is 3,000 billion worth of euro, and the sum of the two, you work it out. So let me go back to this concept. Okay, if you believe that the state may intervene for schools, but we pay for it. Having my son or my daughter or my grandson pay for this, I don't agree. So first of all, let's clarify this concept, and then also the question of debt. When I was pretty young, I had approved the fact that the pension value is the debt of states. They approved this in '94. It took us 3 days and 3 nights fighting on this. I wanted to change the parameters of Maastricht, but they didn't change. So in Europe, we really tell horrendous lies to our children. We are telling them that the debt is really high, but it's much higher. So, and nobody says that. Maybe in the future, we'll put this number too, because it's important. I mean, the OECD in '94 accepted this, but they did not put it in the Maastricht Treaty parameters. Thank you.
My question is for Professor Horvitz, and is about the relation between the question of the size of the government and the question of managing fiscal and monetary policy, which I believe are two very separate issues. And I think that the case for a smaller government would gain strength if it's disconnected with the question of fiscal and monetary policy management. Let me just explain briefly. I think the question of the size of the government is a real resource question. What percentage of the real resources on economy are used towards the public purpose, whatever that means. And where the fiscal and monetary policy is a wholly different question of managing something called the state currency, that is the monopoly of the state. Hayek was for the currency competition, but we don't have that world. We have a world of currency monopoly in all countries in the world except the euro area, and that's why the euro area is doing so badly. And the fact that the state currency is a monopoly means that the central bank has the power to inject currency as oil in an engine, and I said oil, not fuel. Yep. Oil doesn't accelerate the engine, it simply makes the engine working smoothly. And that's why I'm not concerned with that steep rise of the monetary base in the United States. What concerns me is the bailouts, which is the story behind it, rescuing shareholders and bank managers who did not deserve to be rescued. But the expansion of monetary base doesn't worry me. It's just like it simply means an engine needs more oil, more oil. And the other implication is that the state currencies being a monopoly means that the currency in circulation depends on government net spending. The spending in addition to taxes, and which is what we call deficit. I prefer to call it net spending. And you may have a small government and still net spending. And I don't think, I think your case would be strengthened if you disconnect with the notion of balanced budget. In the Zurich meeting, we had an interesting discussion with Warren Mosler about the balanced budget. And in the United States, there have been 6 cases of balanced budgets in the last 100 years, yep. And every single time a depression followed. The last one is the surplus of Clinton in 2000, followed by the crisis today. So I think that the case would gain strength if it's disconnected with the question of a balanced budget and the monetary policy issues. Thank you.
Ok, allora se ce n'è una in fondo così prendo anche l'ultima.
A last question maybe. No, there's another 2, I think. We need to understand the existing correlation between investment and taxation. I didn't understand this fully. It was sort of avoided, let's say, as a topic, but I'd like to have, I'd like you to elaborate on this, the correlation between investment and taxation. Good evening. I wanted to go back to what had been said before on the similarities between the need for banks to implement pre-pension schemes and why states don't do it. My interpretation is that states may increase their prices as much as they want and banks can't. These prices are the taxes which are then paid by citizens. And the taxes is the price that you have to pay for living in a certain country. Going back to what's been said before on Exit, do you think that there might be migratory flows of people, of societies, and what economies should benefit from these possible flows? Okay, let's see if I can sort of summarize them all. I'd like to also add a little question of my own for Mr. Horwitz as well, but also for Professor Horwitz. So just a comment. You need to explain to me why, when a centre-right government was the government, liberalism was not applied. Why is it? Is there like a repulsion here? I mean, because we've seen that it, obviously with a centre-left government, you would expect certain things to happen. But it didn't happen even with ministers who said that they were liberalist. And this is not very justifiable or explainable to the Martian that you were referring to. The other thing I wanted to understand is this. Well, let's imagine that you are right and that we're all moving towards a reduction, a healthy reduction of fiscal pressure and of the state debt. And we have a lighter state, polycentric, and Europe and Italy become a different country. Now, this model eliminates what was being said before in the first question, with the new emerging powers, has to confront itself with the new emerging powers, which are certainly not polycentric in their functions. China, Brazil, what about India, which is polycentric only ethnically speaking, but otherwise it absolutely isn't so in terms of its economic model. So to confront ourselves with this new world, which is not made up of Western democracies, where we decide to choose Hobbes, Locke rather than Mills, but rather completely new models, doesn't it maybe cause our weakening vis-a-vis other economies? I mean, the Chinese growth, I mean, they decide how many millions of people will move from the city to the country, from the country to the city, what sectors will go well, which one. We don't want the Chinese model, but we will have to come to terms with this. And so who can give me an answer for quantitative easing, whether we should have it in Europe too?
Two questions on monetary policy. It's a very big debate right now among market-friendly liberals in the United States in particular over this question. There's people like this guy named Scott Sumner and others who have argued just your case, which is we shouldn't be worried at all about the base, about expansion of money supply. We should be doing more of it, as a matter of fact, and the ECB should be doing more of it. I mean, that's the case that they're making. I mean, certainly, to continue your analogy, if you put too much oil in the engine, it'll light on fire, right? So we, can we go too far with it? I think is a good question. One little note: the nice thing about the competition and currency argument is it works just like the competition among the political jurisdictions. You have the right of exit if you don't like the currency. If I don't like my cell phone provider, I go to someone else. So I think that's a very interesting debate. I think the other thing I meant to say this in my presentation and didn't. The problem in the United States right now is we've created all this base money, and it's just sitting in the banks, and the banks aren't lending it. Now, that might be a good thing in the sense that if they were lending it, we'd have serious inflation problems. But perhaps we'd like to see them lending more of it, or some of it anyway, and that would be a way to get the economy going again. But banks are very hesitant, and I think that they just see too much uncertainty out there. They're able to get the Fed started paying interest on their reserve holdings, so they can get a little bit of rate of return that way. And so the Fed just keeps flooding this stuff in. One last point on quantitative easing. I think part of the problem there is that the choice of assets the Fed has been buying has been a de facto bailout, of course, right? That by what they're buying is they're taking these bad assets off banks' balance sheets, and that's a net transfer of wealth to those banks. That's not whatever else that isn't very good monetary policy. It's something else, and for me that's the real problem. Even if you think the money supply should be expanded, doing it the way the Fed's done it, I think, has been a mistake and has just essentially been a transfer of wealth to the banking system, and that's a problem.
Allora, grazie perché hai risposto anche alla domanda che riguardava appunto la leva monetaria come olio per...
Yes, thank you very much in answering also this first question. On the printing of money, I'd like to hear also from Verzelli. I'm very scared by numbers. We've seen this in the slides. Japan printing 2 billion in 2 years, 1,000 billion in the US, UK 400 billion a year. I'm really scared with these amounts because they are part of a battle which is made amongst the various countries to make currencies weaker and to urge those who don't do it into doing it. But I think that we are quite ahead of the game. I think that we have already passed half of the bridge. So I don't know if we should, let's say, join these mechanisms belatedly after having taken our positions in the ECB. And then I also look at the past experience. Europe, from this point of view, and this has also come up from the discussion, has appeared to be very weak in this phase. And this has been seen when the euro was created. What did the euro countries do, and how could they ill-interpret a quantitative easing of the central bank? We entered the euro, started spending again, and at this point I wouldn't want the bill to be paid at the end to become even higher than what we will have to be, than what we would have to pay doing nothing. Well, yes, this is the political risk. You start printing money, and then okay, everybody's free to do what they want.
Who would like to get back to me on national equality, which is an interesting question? Again, debt, budget policies. But basically what we do, we pass this on to future generations very rapidly. And then I'll turn it over to Steve. We believe that the idea of indebting future generations is quite a recent one. I mean, this is not true. It's very old. It dates back to 3 centuries. Alexander Hamilton, the American founder who wanted to destroy the states, ultra-centralist, is famous for calling our public debt public blessing, an authentic public blessing. Why? Because this will keep states in peace and safe, because we have to pay back the debt during the forthcoming generations, and the federal government will have this instrument vis-a-vis future generations. There is no other way, either the live citizens or the one to be will have to pay. That people cannot pay, obviously. Somebody tried, Fiorani tried to do that, but maybe Steve will get back on this. But going back to what Barisoni raised, it is unreal, surreal that one of the arguments to adopt crazy taxation, huge governments, huge continental blocks with the taxation level at 60–70%. What are the others doing? It's as if in the West there was no history of mercantilism, of dirigism, explaining all that occurred. We don't need to look at the rest of the world to ask for more centralization. We were the ones that have taught to China that capitalism equals centralization, centralized decision-making. We have nothing to learn from them. We have been teaching everything to them. You have mentioned the Italian system, the big Lombard system of healthcare. There's 3 people. One is for the people who know somebody like myself. I am an academic. I can call up one of my colleagues and they will treat us. They will treat even our family. It's very nice, but not everybody is a university academic person in Milan or professor. The other system is made for people who know nobody. Ask them how it works. The third healthcare system is Switzerland. It's called Switzerland. So I wouldn't want to forget a few questions, but now I didn't want more taxation. Of course, there's enough. Or I didn't want more state. I was simply asking that maybe we could imagine to reduce the weight of taxation and the state and to bring it down to levels of more efficiency and of more presence on the territory, less state. Maybe we would have leaner political structures and not extremely heavy policies like in emerging countries.
Address your question from earlier as well. It's why don't we see center-right governments reducing the size of government, which I think is related to this question. Again, the incentives for politicians to take these steps are very weak, right? Even center-right politicians still have to get votes, and to the extent that the public still wants more programs and more benefits from government, if they want to continue to get reelected, they're going to have to deliver. And so the structural features of the political system are such that even people who say they're committed to shrinking the role of government, it's very, very difficult to do it. And how you get there, I think, and how you get to the world that Marco's talking about is a real problem. One quick thought on the debt, or 2 quick thoughts on the debt thing. By the way, I agree. I'd rather have a government small in scope with a larger deficit than a large government in scope with a smaller deficit, right? So I think that's a Milton Friedman line too, because I think the real damage is done not by the debt per se, but by what the government is doing. That's what really affects that denominator, is what kinds of policies it's adopting. That said, the real costs of government debt are multiple, right? Certainly it's borne by later generations. The fact that we are borrowing now to consume now means there's less capital for the future. Even if we don't think about who will pay it off, the fact that we have taken resources from the future and consumed them now means my children and grandchildren will have less in the future. But it also means right now, right, that as governments borrow more, and governments tend to borrow to transfer and consume, especially if they're borrowing for war where they borrow to destroy, okay, that's a real loss of resources right now. It's always been strange to me that so many young people are so concerned, and not just young people, but particularly young people, are so concerned about environmental issues and about the injustice that our generation, has left them supposedly with an impoverished planet, and pollution and so on, that it's unfair that we've put this burden on them and their children. But they're not very concerned about the debt, are they? Right? And the debt's the exact same argument. We've done the same thing. And I'd in fact argue the costs are bigger. It's worse. And I think, if I could if there's one thing I could do, I would want to convince young people today to take that question of the burden of the debt more seriously and to be yelling at their elders about what we've done to them, because we have. And I think that's a real thing.
Potrei concludere, se non ci sono altre domande.
If there are no more questions, I could conclude on the basis of what Mr. Horwitz was saying before. That is, it's not that to think of a lesser state, not the absence, but less state, and therefore also less taxation to maintain the state is necessarily, as Horwitz was saying, only possible for elites, in the sense that if you are presenting a program which is maybe more center-right for social issues and so on, or even on religious things, but if then you try and see, if you leave the area of the role of the church or gay marriage, and then you talk about the role of the state, be it center-left or center-right, on the basis of what's been said before, you need to have a 51% of the population agreeing, and whether it's the right, center-right or center-left, you will have to make a lot of stakeholders happy, and probably in the end you will never reduce the role of the state. Maybe this is a paradox, I don't know, it could be paradoxical, that less state can only be achieved by elites. Yes, I'd like to add something on this topic, and I think that what is the great discovery, not so much of Pareto, Michels, and so on, but Gramsci, that is the discovery that the population in the end really thinks exactly like elites do. It's not the mass of Italians that's state-oriented. It's that the elite has been state-oriented throughout its history in Italy. So what we're talking about is this. So we are saying maybe this is elitarian. The elites are state-centered. They've made the population like this. The population will stop being like this when elites will stop. Now, this will last 5 minutes, and they won't even remember that they had been state-centered. Yeah, it's a bit like the former communists, maybe, that tell us these stories, but I wanted to give a very quick answer to the provocations by Barisoni, who wanted me to say that the state is good. No, I'm joking, but he wanted me to say that maybe the state must be of some use somehow or other. If we had been in Berlin or in Stalingrad, if we were two generals of the Wehrmacht and it were 1942 and we were there discussing, and you told me, well, but patriotism is important, to love your country is important, probably I wouldn't have been able to answer. We will talk about it when this mere folly is over. In the same way, I'm telling you, when the statalist folly will be over, we will rediscuss about the role and the presence of the state and the goodness of the state. Okay, I think that's enough. Thank you.